Very briefly that originally this property was part of the railroad land grant to the, I believe, the Northern Pacific Railroad, who subsequently sold it to Weyerhaeuser, or at least Weyerhaeuser logged it around 1918 and 1920, correct?
Yeah, 1918, 1919.
It depends on which side of the road you're talking about here. Which went first, Keith?
The south side of the Scott Turner Road was logged in about 1918, and the north side was in about 1919. It was sold off to Oscar Anderson at some point. My grandfather, Robert Wise, bought the property in 1954.
Yes.
And he didn't want this part because it was too wet. And so
There you go.
we've been managing it.
That was mine.
He passed away in 1966. My mom and dad inherited part of it, and it's been operated as a continual unit since the late 60s. Our first harvest area that we did was here in the 1976 plantation, and it was a alder and vine maple jungle at the time, and it was mostly just a hardwood conversion, get it back into some good forest land, some good Douglas fir. And so on the tour today, we're going to come through the 76 plantation, which has been thinned twice. And we're going to come up through this 91 plantation and through what we call Unit A, which has been pretty much unmanaged property. And then skirt along this 2014, the Grandpa Wise Memorial Plantation. And that one is named such because the last day of planting on that was coincidentally his birthday. So we thought, oh, that's an appropriate name for that one. And then we'll come up through what we refer to as the hook of the 76 plantation. We'll see some of the co-planting of the western red cedar and Sitka spruce. And then I think we're going to end up back about here. Is that right? Okay.
I don't know, there was some talk about having half go one way and half go the other way on that tour. But yeah, those are the stations. The objective of the farm is to have a sustained timber yield. The different plantations you see here, or units, if they've got a number or a name, they are plantations that we have harvested and replanted. If they're labeled with a letter yet, right, E, D, F, A, G, those are naturally reseeded areas from the harvest a little over 100 years ago. They've been thinned, but not really managed. With, what is it, 13 units, we can harvest and replant about every 6 or 7 years. Realistically, 5 to 10, depending on demand and markets. It's one of the advantages to growing trees, say, as opposed to wheat. You don't have to harvest, on schedule. You can adjust yourself to markets and conditions and need and weather, etc. But
About the chart. This is
yeah,
the cut chart.
the idea though is that with a rotation of about 80 to 100 years, somewhere in there for any given unit, we can harvest every 6 or 7 years and do it forever. Sustainably, this is basically history. Roughly speaking, these are units that have been harvested or planned to be harvested. The rectangles actually show the amount of board feet that were taken out. And this line here basically is a sustainable cut yield. So long as we stay on this side of the line, we can go on taking out blocks like this forever, and the forest will stay looking very much like you see it right here. Well, and the other plantations you're going to see.
Yeah.
This right here behind you. This is part of the original natural reproduction.
Harvested this side in 1918. Big forest fire went through in 1920.
Yeah, I was wondering if we are going to mention that.
and anything that was still standing was destroyed. And
Yeah.
at that time, it was just all natural reseeding. And so what you see here is 1918. The last one that we did, let me flip this back over again a second here. And I'll need your pointer.
Ruby's pointer.
Yeah, the unit up here was cut in 2019.
Planted in 19, wasn't it?
Okay, yeah, cut in
18.
2018, planted in 2019, which was 100 years after it had last been harvested, and so this one's named the Centennial Plantation. And when we come through the hook here of the 76 plantation, the hook of Unit A, we'll see the paired planting with the western red cedar and Sitka spruce. And we did some pair planting in this unit. This is about 20 acres. We did half of it with the traditional Vexar nets, and then the other half of it we did paired planting with Douglas fir and Sitka spruce. And there's a little bit of cedar down here in a wetter swale too. So each of these plantations have names that just seem to have fit at the time of the plantings.
Yeah, a lot of family history in the names. We don't need to go there. Yeah. But for people who are into soils especially, most of the farm is a cinnabar. This part right in here is clabber or claver. I'm not sure how the pronunciation, but that's okay. Yeah, this green part right in here, that's a clabber silt, and it's basically flat and wet and does not grow trees very well. That's why our grandfather chose not to buy that particular 40 acres. Yeah, all this brown here, that's most of the farm, that's cinnabar soils. This little bit right here, I think, is actually a Kapowsin loam. But there's actually 5 or 6 different soil types altogether. By and large, though, it's most of the productive land is the cinnabar soils.
What's the blue one?
I'd have to look it up. That's basically the riparian zone.
It's right below you there on the chart.
Oh, okay. Okay, I was going from memory. I didn't realize you had it printed here. Yeah, it's a humquats.
I just like the name.
Texture, muck, very poor, drained, 20 inches. I can tell you it's, in terms of production, it's, what, category 5?
Actually, it's not rated because it is too wet to grow trees. But
Yeah, you get a little bit of alder, a little bit of fir, but it's mostly just too wet. I mean, a little bit of cedar, but it's mostly just too wet.
Yeah, mostly canary grass.
I have a question.
Yes.
On your graph there, are those anticipated sustainable yield amounts from the thinned forest as well as the the tree harvest areas that have been managed more?
I don't think so.
Yeah, it does
I
not
think
include-
that's just final harvest.
Oh, okay.
Any commercial thinning is in addition to what you see on the chart.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the chart itself it wouldn't stand up to scrutiny under careful analysis. But the data is, estimated and rough, and it's more of a visual tool to talk about sustainability and how you can continue to harvest so long as you're replanting and you're maintaining a plan. It's sustainable forever.
Yeah, you could certainly add the thinnings in there, but it would just make it a whole lot more complicated.
Hey,
So Steve,
it's already more of a rule of a thumb than a careful analysis.
so one of the purposes of us being here is to kind of get folks introduced to a forest management plan and the need for a plan, a guided plan. You want to introduce us to your work there, or just you don't have to.
I'm not going to read it, no.
No.
Just highlighting that you guys have had this plan for a while, and you basically use it to track your activities and
Yeah.
what you want to be doing.
That's
So
I don't know what to say on that.
okay, so one of the things that what Margaret and I do, and also is we work with landowners, small landowners, to develop a forest management plan. And in some cases, we don't have to do anything. They're very interested and engaged, and then other places we'll actually do a lot of the work for them. And we follow what's the the forest practices illustrated, which guides you through that. And so a forest management plan basically tells you what you have, and then it tells you what you're going to be doing in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And so today what we're going to be talking about is some general issues that would show up in the forest management plan. But we were really fortunate to have the Townsend family bring us up here and use this farm. We had nothing absolutely to do with the planning. I did the graphics, that's about it. One of the things that's very cool about it is that it's the work that they've done is modeling exactly what you want to do in a forest in terms of how you manage it for that long-term gain and that idea of a sustainable cut. So that's exactly what we're looking to illustrate today, both the involvement and engagement of the family in this, but also the planning process and what we're looking at. And then the idea that, as they mentioned, they have, I think it's, 15? No, how many different stands?
I think it was 14 units.
14 different
Is that
units.
many?
And so if you think about it, that's dividing the 200 acres, that's how much time it
1,
takes to
2,
build
3, 4,
Um,
6, 7, 8, 9, 10. No, 13.
13.
Yeah, and that's counting G as a unit. It's really probably closer to 12.
And so the idea for us is that's why we're here today, is give you some ideas what they would go through, and then also just illustrate that a plan is incredibly important if you own property, and that's really important that landowners engage in that planning process, just like you all are.
Yeah, well, that's what makes the management plan here, kind of complex. There's some overall ideas and concepts that fit nicely into the format, but then when there's 12 or 13 management units, each one has to be itemized as to when it was planted, when it's thinned, when it's commercially thinned, and how many times, when it's pruned, any number of things that we might have in mind for the unit, and then finally a harvest and a replant. And that makes for pretty boring reading. It basically has long lists of activities in each unit, but
It's not a cast in stone agenda.
yeah, that's important. Yeah, it's a blueprint. It's a plan. The plans are important. I mean, you can't change your plans until you have some. And even the best laid plans, Mother Nature sometimes comes along and says, we're not going to do it that way after all. It's got to be flexible.
perfect example of that is this windthrown plantation.
Hence,
That was from
names
big
and
windstorm that we had in 2006. Typically during the winter time, there'll be some windstorms, there'll be some blowdowns, and we might salvage a load of timber. After that windstorm, Steve and Dave came up and they started counting the downed trees, and they stopped counting when they got to 100. And they said, this isn't going to be a rescue operation, this is going to be a recovery operation. And so that particular harvest area is the biggest one that we have. It's probably about 26 acres.
yeah.
And
We're
that
gonna-
wasn't part of the plan, but that
Yeah.
was Mother Nature's plan.
So we're gonna go ahead and take
Yeah.
a hike down the road and kind of look at some of the results of your planning and
Okay.
what you guys have been working on all these years.
Typically, our unit, our management units are designed to be around 20 acres, give or take. The number of 20 is pretty important. It's kind of a compromise between a lot of things. If you don't have 20 acres at least, it's difficult to get commercial harvesters interested in actually harvesting the stand. It takes a lot of time, energy, and money to move all their equipment in, to do the harvest, and then pick it up and move on. 20 acres is about as much as the family can cope with when it comes to the planting, the netting, the thinning down the road. It takes a lot of time and effort to manage, especially the new plantations. Finally, 5-6 years later, when the trees are up above the deer and established and growing, then we can start to think about what's going to be the next harvest. And so this, for us, the 20 acres once every 7 years is a good model to work with.
So let's go ahead and up the road and look at your.
I'm going to talk. All right, let's catch our breath a little bit from the hike up the hill here. So right now we're in the 76 plantation, correct? Okay. And how long ago did you guys thin this piece?
Keith, we started thinning, in the mid-'80s, and we had done a light pre-commercial thinning, but this was thinned just a year or so ago
Okay,
to where the current spacing is now.
right.
I planted these trees.
Yeah.
14 years old. Steve is in Australia.
So this is kind of a great example of what you can do. You planted these trees yourself and now you get to harvest them yourself. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a full circle moment here for their family. And as a commercial thinning, there's a couple reasons why you would want to commercially thin. The basic concept for thinning is you want to adjust your stand density to allow for better growth of the existing trees in the area. So you can see, what's standing here are kind of the best trees that we wanted to leave, or they wanted to leave, to then create a better stand in the future. Your removal of these trees takes away some of the competition for the resources that exist in the stand. Mainly, light and water are a couple of the biggest ones. And by doing that, you're also increasing that resiliency into the future because these trees aren't being stressed. Stress is a big cause of tree mortality. There has to be a initial factor that weakens a tree to make them more susceptible to pests and diseases. So just like if we are stressed or tired or thirsty, hungry, we're gonna not feel great. And so it's the same with trees. We got to make sure they're getting the resources they need for their future survival. So that's where we think about thinning as a tool that we can use to do that and help ensure some better survival rates into the future. Another benefit of thinning is it is along with the stress reduction, it reduces the potential for fire risk in the area. You know, your trees are going to be lusher and greener. You're not going to see a lot of standing dead. That would be a source of fuel that would allow, you know, fire to get up into the canopy or things like that. So that's another thing we got to start thinking about more when we're seeing a lot of the effects of changing climate and changing weather patterns. So another thing to think about if you're looking at doing a commercial thinning is some of the harvest and the management of that harvest. So considerations before your harvest, it depends on your property and the type of trees you're looking at and the age and size of your trees. But some basic things you want to think about are, you know, what type of thinning is going to work. You know, how many trees do you need to be removing to see those benefits? You know, can you access the stand? Do you have a rocked road that you can get to? So what time of year can you get to the stand? If you've got a rocked road, it's, you know, generally all year round, you can probably get in there and do some kind of a work. You know, what's your estimated volume you're going to remove? That kind of depends on, you know, when you're thinking about who you can hire, who you can afford to hire, and still get a return on your investment there for the thinning. And something that's helpful is, you know, if you don't have experience with that, talking to a consultant or a forester, or, you know, people like Rosalind at the Small Forest Landowner Office, they can kind of point you in the right direction on some of the things you got to do before your harvest. So then actually getting into it, there's a few different methods you can use to do harvest. A lot of them are going to involve machines, especially at this size and stage of trees. You're going to have some mechanical step involved. You know, sometimes you can have different combinations. You know, you can have someone hand fall your trees and then come in and skid them and drag them to a landing where they're processed by another machine. You can also have them hand fall and processed on the ground where they fall and then drug in and put on a self-loading truck. It kind of depends, you know, a lot on some of the things we talked about before about access and your site characteristics. Another thing to look at, and this is where, you know, a consultant or someone could definitely come in helpful, is your contract management. So, you know, who's going to be the one getting the permits for the harvest? Who's going to be checking the logs as they leave? Who's going to be checking your remaining trees to make sure that there's not damage happening? You know, we can see out here, there's a couple trees that are a little bit scraped up, and this can happen during the harvest process. You know, when if they're driving through there, or if they're falling, you know, you can have damaged trees. So you want to make sure your operator is responsible and is minimizing that kind of damage that can happen. But you also want to be, you know, checking to make sure that, you know, you want to be out here taking a look, you know, are things happening the way you want them to happen? You know, another thing we talked about when we initially came out here with Steve and the family, there's a kind of a big gap here that maybe wasn't supposed to be quite so big. So especially looking up into the canopy out here, it's a little more space than maybe we would have liked to see. And, you know, that's kind of one of the things you can look at for quality control is, you know, are they doing the spacing the way you want them to do it? Is it going to be efficient, or are they kind of picking the logs they want to take and not the ones you want them to take? So while we're looking up in the canopy, we want to think about the spacing here, and you can see the length of the branches. So when you're looking at thinning, you want to see that space between the canopy, because that's the area that your trees are going to grow into. So we want to see, you know, 10 to 15 feet from the tip to tip, and then over the next 10 to 15 years, all that space is going to go away as the tree grows. So You know, we see a lot of light here now, but that's going to go away pretty quick as that tree is going to put on a lot of growth and take over the space that we've given it. So, all right.
So there's an X and
Ooh.
a string around that one.
Yeah.
What's that mean?
What's that mean, Steve?
Changed our mind.
Okay.
As you're saying, the spacing here is pretty wide, and like she was saying, you need to be on site to working with your operator, and you need to inspect what you expect. And the operator was working. We got up here. We said, "You're cutting way too many trees out of here," and so it is very thin right here, and they had marked trees to be cut. At the time they used a red paint, which was really hard for the operator to see, and so we came back later and we marked them with the blue paint, and then sometimes someone decided, nah, we're going to keep that one after all. So if you see an X that has a ribbon around it, that means, okay, this was a mistake. Do not cut this tree.
Okay.
But by time he got towards the end, you'll see a lot of trees that have X's that had been marked to be cut that they chose not to cut. I mean, you have some things like this one that has this real miserable double top on it that it'd be nice if that one were gone. But sometimes, because of the natural spacing, well, if you cut that one, there'd be a huge hole there. So, okay, we'll leave that one.
Yeah, so that just highlights, you know, why quality control is important, and as the landowner, you got to be on your toes a little bit, and it also helps to have someone in your corner who can be
An advocate.
an advocate for you, exactly. So a consultant or another professional that you can have to, you know, have your back on that. Another great thing and why you should have a contract is talking about, you know, cleanup. You know, a harvest is kind of a messy operation, and your forest isn't exactly going to look the same once you're done. So there's some expectations on cleanup that, you know, you should have in your contract, what your operator is going to do for you before they pull their machinery out. And, you know, making sure you're going over a lot of those detail points that, you know, they might think is standard, but if you haven't done it before, you know, it's not standard to you, and, you know, you want to, if it's somewhere you live or you work in and it's important to you, you want to talk to them about that and make sure everyone's on the same page with what you're doing. Yeah.
What you're saying, and to meld it with what Keith just said, contracts, yes, they're important, but in truth, it's nothing but a bunch of words on paper, and the logger probably hasn't even read it. All right, it's really, really important that you're on site and involved, but out of their way simultaneously. It's hard to describe it. If you're here and you're supervising the planting or the thinning or the harvest, even if you don't understand what they're doing, if you just, you know, put on the red vest and stand around and look important, they know the owner is here and watching you, and they're much more likely to do a good job of whatever it is they're supposed to be doing. We have learned that the hard way 2 or 3 times.
Yeah, and don't be afraid to ask questions on what they're doing. They should be able to tell you exactly why they're doing what they're doing.
Yep.
Glenn.
Sorry to miss this. Can you remind me if this is was a pre-commercial thin or is it a commercial thin?
So this is a commercial thin. Yeah. So, sorry.
How long ago?
So
Just a
you
year
said
ago.
just a year. Yeah. So it was 76. So these trees are about 50-ish years old now. So
This is a very special plantation to us. This is the very first one. This was mostly vine maple, a bit of alder, and a few big trees. And Mom and Dad worked with a forester at the time, and they laid this out and cut it, scarified it, and then the family literally planted all these trees ourselves, and we've did the first couple of pre-commercial thinnings ourselves. All the pruning we have done ourselves. It was this commercial thinning that you see here a year ago. It's the first time we hired anybody to do anything in this particular plantation. Since then, there's been a lot of other plantations, and a lot of it has been hired out. We've learned, what we can realistically do on our own and what we can't, and especially, when you go from one plantation to 5 or 6 and another 3 or 4 in the planning, you begin to realize, no, we definitely need some professional help in here, because there's just more than we can do, literally, with our own chainsaw and the time that we have available.
And limited amount of time.
Yeah.
And
And
we all
in
have
this
jobs.
particular case, even though we had thinned it a couple of times on ourselves, look at the size of the trees. We don't have the equipment to do this kind of thinning when the trees are this big. This had to be a professional job.
Do you have another entry planned, or is this going to grow through till final harvest now?
We had in mind for this to be the first commercial thinning, but we're down to like 150 maybe trees per acre here. I'm thinking
I think this
there
is gonna
might be
it.
some selective trees taken out in a few, like another 2 or 3 decades, but for the most part, this was over thinned, at least in our mind, from what we were looking for. This is probably the last thing. We're just going to let this grow for another 40 or 50 years, and it'll be ready for, what will it be, the third harvest and a replanting. We can talk a little more about this when we get down to what we call the cedar hook, or the annex. This parcel's only 17 acres, but another 2 or 3 was kind of added to it recently. To actually merge the two together is going to take about another, between 100 and 200 years. But we have a plan.
So another thing to highlight when we talk a lot about spacing in forestry, and so we got a table here that's a good little reference, and we want to think about spacing as far as, establishing trees and then ensuring their continual growth. So we have a recommended spacing. We usually plant, between 10 and 12 feet spacing between trees, and that's about 360 trees an acre. And then as you progressively thin your stand, you go from about that, and then you'll probably take a third out of that to be, about 250.
That would be the pre-commercial thin would knock it down to 250.
Right, either pre-commercial or your first commercial thinning. Kind of depends on your growth, your plan there.
And if it were a commercial thin a little bit later, it would probably be pulp wood or maybe a few sawlog.
Yeah, it'd be kind of small at that stage. If it was at a 300 trees per acre spacing, yeah, you'd be at a pretty small tree. So as we talk about thinning, we're talking a lot about, these stages that we thin at start to increase the growth of the tree at very important stages in the development. So we don't want the tree to ever really stop growing or stagnate in growth. So that's why that spacing is really key to that. So then in the commercial thinning, you'd look at taking, probably another third out. So then we'd end up with, about 100 trees per acre as it goes into a mature stand. And that can drop even below 100 trees, depending on your crown size and your diameter at that time. So a lot of it's based on, what you've got when you're looking at thinning and where you want it to go.
The next unit that we're going to walk through, has the first thinning has been done, and you'll see a tremendous difference.
Yeah.
Another
kind of fun exercise that's kind of easy to do on this site is look at the old growth stumps and where things were originally. And often their spacing is still significantly further apart than what we would do that final grow to harvest. But I mean, you guys, it doesn't sound like your objective is to grow to old growth and manage that. But I just think it's neat to be able to like picture the original forest. You've got a lot of cedar here. We're sort of on this north coast, this northerly aspect. And you can kind of use that a little bit to guide some of your management activities too.
Yeah.
So, you know, one of the things that we talk about on that management is, and what they pointed out here is that this is a mostly naturally, you planted a lot of this as a plantation at the beginning, but you also had some natural seeding come in at the beginning.
Sure.
Yeah.
Look along the edge. Most of that.
That rosin cut down over there.
Most of, you can see where our trees stop, and that's the neighbor's property.
Right.
But there's a lot of natural seeding that happens too.
So when we talk about spacing on these thinnings, one of the things that we look at is not just the spacing between the trees, but there are and Margaret mentioned this earlier, there are different methodologies for doing that thinning for different purposes. So one of the reasons you can do what we call patch thinning or variable density thinning would be to create some patches where we got some more sunlight. And then there's other things that are going on in terms of overall forest health and the like that we would address. The other issue that we're looking at, and like we said, this where we're standing right now is fairly wide. But if you look down in there, it gets to be a little bit thinner, or a little bit more dense. And that was partly, y'all stopped them part of the way, is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's about what the objective they're going for. So we're going to be talking a lot about spacing, and the reason for that is because that's the terminology we use for growing trees for productive purposes. That doesn't have to be your only purpose. Just like any tools, the tools that we use in forestry are ubiquitous. They can be used in all sorts of different types of things to grow trees for different purposes. So we talk a lot about spacing, primarily, as Margaret pointed out, for health and productivity, and for the purposes that, as an example, you've got some pole logs that was up on the hill there.
Yeah.
So, what average length was like 80?
Oh, at least. Yeah, but anywhere from 80 to, we had I think the longest was 102 foot.
Okay. So what they say, when we say pole log, what that means is if you take a look at one of these trees, it would go up another 50 feet, and the bole, the main stem of the tree, wouldn't have any branches on it, because that's the pole log is for using as a telephone pole. It has to be clear and not free. So that's what if you want to generationally, because that is generational growth, going for 100 years. It's going to take a few generations to get there. You're going to want to manage for a tighter canopy so you don't have as much light, because more light is going to support more branches on the tree. So, but this spacing, what you're seeing here right now is an optimal spacing for an old growth forest, 100 to 120 stems per acre, something like that. This spacing right here. Over there, that's a next generation productive forest. So we're going to break up. If we want to.
Do we need to break up? I think.
You all comfortable with the spacing? Are you good? Are there questions? Okay. And going back to it, any questions you have for this? Get Margaret with them.
Any questions before we?
With all this?
Oh yeah. So.
Where we're standing was the landing when they thinned it. That's why it's so open right where we're standing. Anything of value has been taken. Some of this will be cut up for firewood and used here, but most of it will rot right where it is.
Often at the end of a harvest, you'll kind of not have enough wood left for a full load, or at the end, the tops of a tree or small stuff that can't be taken away. So that's another thing to talk about with your contractor, is where you want that left and so you can do something with it if it's there, or if there's a way for them to get it taken away, then they can take it away.
And they can create quite good opportunities for habitat as well. And so aesthetically, we often just want to clear everything out in our mind. We sort of like that nice clean park look, but that's not always what's best for wildlife.
Most of our cuttings, the contract calls for what they call lop and scatter. Basically, you leave all the brush out in the field and close to the ground. Enough space so that a planting crew can get in and plant, but leave most of it there to rot and stay in the land. Provide some habitat for the little critters anyway until the trees are taller again, and providing shade for the bigger animals.
And good for soil, too.
Yep.
Yeah, it goes back into the soil.
Who was your logger? They did a good job with their damage.
Look at the tree rings all over.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any questions about this?
Yeah, a good thing, you know, as we're walking, you can look at the tree rings in these piles here, and you can kind of see how old they are and, you know, how much growth they put on over the years.
Well, we can take a borer for some samples if you wish.
Sure.
That takes
Did you bring
time.
that? I don't think we brought that up with us, so.
Oh,
So,
don't you have it in
so
your
one of
pocket?
the things that's really cool about what you'll see in this stand from the harvest here, if you look at the rings, they're pretty regular, and that's really important because that means that the tree's continuing to grow. When they get tight and small, that means that's when it's about time to thin, and that just means there's not as much resources. And then when they get too wide, it's just too open, and they're growing too fast, which can happen. But what we see here in this forest, it's really well managed, and we can tell that because the rings are pretty regular. One of the things too, just as they get large, trees get larger and larger, the rings are going to get smaller and dense in thickness. Not because the trees are slowing down so much in growth, it's just that there's so much volume, more volume for that size of that circle that it's creating. So it's really important for us in terms of like productivity, but also for health and the staging, and we're going to make that cut. And so we will use something like an increment bore where you'll go into a tree and see if there is kind of an impact or if it's time to release the stand or not. If there's no more questions, which way do we want to go as a group? We can go down this way or we can go up that way.
Let's go that way.
Let's put it right.
You don't want
In now. So basically, riparian areas have often been thought of as kind of the you know, lifeblood of the connection between forest and riverine or stream systems. The riparian area itself, what it means is the area influenced by the surface water and underground water at a site. So you'll have trees that have a lot more tolerance, trees and other plants that have a lot higher tolerance for high water table. So right here, for example, we have a lot more alders, the white barked trees here. They are early colonizers, first disturbed sites along rivers and streams, and they actually fix nitrogen in the soil. They're a good early successional tree that you'll often find. Sometimes at managed forest sites, we want to speed up succession a bit, so maybe we're going to move some of those alders out of the way and make room for commercially viable trees. But basically, riparian areas can be very important as providing nutrients and shade, and for stream systems where salmon are important species we're managing for oftentimes. But oftentimes in managed forests and family-owned sites, we don't have, we're not right next to salmon-bearing streams, but nonetheless, the water, the streams or rivers, the water that we're next to is still important from a regulatory standpoint and from an ecological standpoint. So we want to manage for that influence of the water on a site and on a forest. Yeah, I think we can, kind of along with that is term with a new influence of water or a distinct influence of water at a site. You'll have invasive species that can move into riparian sites that can't move into upland sites quite as well. So riparian areas, in addition to being like the wildlife corridors and providing a lot of ecological values, they also provide a lot of opportunities for invasive species. So some of the more common invasive species that are problems that are riparian areas are knotweed. We have several different species of knotweed which can actually grow to such an extent they choke out smaller feeder streams. And there's a whole long list of invasive species or non-native species that do really well at riparian forest sites. So if somebody from the conservation district or the foresters or DNR office comes out, they'll help point out some of those invasive species and strategies for managing them.
On this particular property, we especially see the canary grass, the tansy, the blackberries, not just necessarily the riparian zones, but everywhere. You got the evergreen and Himalayan blackberries, or they really don't hurt your trees any, but my golly, they make managing your woods really difficult. And then the native brush, like the vine maple, is difficult to live with sometimes too.
Yeah, and vine maple can be a big component of an upland site as well. So
It's beautiful,
sort of,
but
from a regulatory standpoint, when we're looking to protect our streams, when we're doing some sort of management activity, our first step is to really classify what type of water it is that we're dealing with. And from a regulatory standpoint, we sort of divide things into two categories. We've got our fish-bearing streams and our non-fish-bearing streams. And often when people think of fish-bearing streams, they think of like salmon trying to make their way up the stream. But we're actually managing for everything. We're managing for small little residential fish, as well as with the idea that, of course, downstream impacts that will contribute to good quality habitat for salmon spawning and things downstream. So if you have water on your site, that's often what we get people's inquiries about. They're like, I've got a stream, or we're not quite sure what we can or what we can't do around it. There's sort of a filter process we have to go through to determine regulatory wise what we can and can't do, and then on site what we really should and shouldn't do. And that is to figure out if it's a fish bearing or non-fish bearing stream. And that's actually just done by the physical characteristics of the stream. We do not have to go see presence of fish on site, but if a stream meets a certain width and a certain gradient, it's automatically considered a fish-bearing stream unless it can be proven otherwise. And that can be done by like an electrofishing protocol, which is often done by larger forest landowners. Usually small forest landowners don't have those kind of resources at their disposal. But in the future, our office will have a biologist on site where we can help people electrofish their streams to help determine the classification, because the riparian setbacks are quite different. If you have a lot greater protections on a fish-bearing stream to a non-fish-bearing stream. And the reason that we're protecting these RMZs, like Glenn spoke to before, we're really trying to maintain what we call the 5 riparian functions, which are shade, large woody debris, sediment filtering, nutrients, and shade, large woody, bank stability. So those 5 riparian functions are, the main contribution to those is really within that first 50, 75 feet of the stream itself. So that's where our strongest protections lie from a regulatory standpoint. Once you get outside that zone, there are more options depending on what your site quality, your site class is at the site, and also how much acreage you own. So if you own less than 20 acres, you have slightly different regulatory requirements than someone who owns more than 20 acres. Let's see, what else?
Is there a way to get that analyzed? Is there help available?
Yeah, so our office with the Department of Natural Resources, we can come out on site and help you type your streams and determine what kind of setbacks would be required and what sort of options might be available on your specific site. So that's a program that's been in existence for quite a while, but it's usually just had one person who's been doing it for the whole state. So now we are ramping up to like 5 people plus a biologist, so our access to come out and help people is hopefully going to be a lot more useful. Oh gosh, fall in the water. Yeah.
One of the reasons that we Margaret and I picked this particular location
If you look back in here, you'll see the alder is in somewhat decline. Alder grows fast, dies young. The situation that we're in is pretty typical for what Margaret and I are seeing on small forest landowners. And when we say small, we're usually under 100 acres. And that distribution of lands that they usually have, I use, unfortunately, if anybody knows the old show Green Acres, people buy a forest, but they don't know that actually half of it is a riparian corridor or a swamp. Or swamp. I'm not the riparian person. Basically, for every forester, there's about 5 fish people in this state. So we let them talk about water. But if you look up in this forest, you can tell right now over here in the back, it's not producing viable timber. And so we get a lot of questions as to what can you do? And Margaret and I don't know the answer to that. So that's why you two are here.
Yeah. So, and that, it also depends a bit like what we're looking at in there. I mean, are you looking at an actual forest wetland, or is it connected to some sort of stream complex, or is it just like a standalone kind of patch that gets a little bit soggy? Because you can harvest in a forested wetland, and it'd probably be worth sort of going around seeing, well, historically, did that site support conifers, or is it a site that has just always been kind of like it currently is?
And the answer to your questions is yes.
Yeah.
The road almost here is kind of the top of a ridge. So it's kind of flat in this area, and there's not much place for the water, like the big puddle there behind you, to go anywhere.
Yeah.
It drops off up down here to the north, basically down the hill that we just climbed up. It's much gentler, but it runs off this way for a quarter mile, and there's another fork of this creek. Cronus Creek there's another fork to it back here. They join together about half, maybe closer to a full mile off to the west, but it's running along the southern property line roughly. And so this has got a very gentle sweep off towards that part of Cronus Creek.
Stages of growth.
That's this one.
Oh, it is. Okay. So if you look around, this is really, really cool point. It's a juxtaposition or joint of 4 different stands of management. And it's all going on right at the same time, right in front of your eyes. History is being made. It's very, very cool. So on this side we have, this is where you step in, Steve. Oh, there's a sign. Here's your sign.
Planted in 2014.
Planted 2014, next harvest 79. Right next to it is the 2004 plantation, and this one's got out to, what are we planting out? We got out to 20 acres. Look like we're going to be harvesting 2084. No. Yes, commercial harvest 2084. So, and then behind you, this is one of the last stands of what you over here.
Yeah, let me rephrase what he said a little bit. Yeah, this was harvested in 2013, planted in 2014. It's looking quite nice now. It's only 10 years younger than the 2004 plantation. So look over here, 10 years from now, this is going to look like this. And if you want to know what's going to look in another 60 or 80 years, turn around and look back there at the bigger trees. That's your natural reprod from 1924.
So really, with your improved genetics and things, you'll be looking at much better trees than what we've got here.
Time will tell, yeah.
So, we'll see more trees there. We'll see more trees than we have over here. We'll see more trees. The canopy won't be as open, depending on how you manage it. If you go smaller trees, but the things that we wanted to point out here on your planting is one of the things we're looking at is the spacing. You notice it's very dense on this side. It's somewhat dense over here, and then it lightens up.
That needs thinning.
This needs thinning. So the decision in terms of when they're going to be making that thinning cut, it's going to be either pre-commercial or commercial, and you'll be doing some pre-commercial thinning in here.
Yeah, a lot, but some of the. It's amazing what they can sell these things. I don't know about that. This would be marginal. There
Okay.
might be something. We'll have to ask. That might strictly be a pre-commercial thin, or it might be commercial. Definitely, the first thinning over here in another 10 years will be pre-commercial. They'll just go through and take out probably about at least a third, maybe as many as a half the trees in those areas where, in addition to the trees we've planted, we've had a number of volunteers.
And you've already done a pre-commercial on this one.
Oh yes.
And so let's focus a little bit on what they did with the planting. Now, this actual planting is, from what we see right in front of us, is a tad light in terms of spacing. But if we look over the hill,
Well, that's mortality.
Yeah,
It wasn't
mortality.
planted light.
and so this is one of the things that we overplant stands here, specifically in the Pacific Northwest. We overplant, and we're usually going to go generally about 600 stems per acre, something like that, 400 to 600 stems per acre. Yeah, depending on where you are, depending on how dry it is. There's some sites like, there's a hillside right over there that's fully south facing. You're going to be trying to plant that pretty dense, just simply because you're going to be dealing with a lot of mortality. And that it seems like it's, we talked a little bit about, it doesn't seem to be making a lot of sense commercially to do that, but it actually does, because you do have mortality over a period of time. The other thing that we're going to be looking at is, in that mortality can be anything from drought, it can be competition, it can be from other species, it can be browsed by deer, and it can be, storms can come in and take out the tops of the trees. That doesn't happen as frequently. It'll happen in alder. But the next thing that we look at in terms of spacing is in terms of the species, and the idea is that one of the things that we want to do is get the trees tight enough together that they're optimally spaced. And optimal spacing has to do with the amount of space that the tree occupies that it can occupy, because eventually what's going to happen is the canopy is going to close in, and this is what we see over here, where the competition actually becomes inter-tree. The trees are actually competing with each other for resources, and that's one of the things that we're looking at for tree health and forest health and productivity, is creating a space where the trees have just enough space to stay alive and just enough space to continue to grow and to grow optimally, but not so much space and not so crowded that they're not spaced so far apart that they're not being that we could maybe squeeze a few more trees in there. So it's easier to subtract the trees from a site at this location than it is to try to go back in and plant more at the same time. So it's kind of this long-term process. We keep our eyes on the amount of trees that are growing at any given time. The things that we go back to, we talked a little bit about the increment more in the growth of the trees, and get an idea of the stem diameter, how fast the diameter is growing. When we look over here on these trees that are young, the things that we're looking at is everybody here familiar with the tree species that we have in the Pacific Northwest? Douglas fir, alder, hemlock, cedar. Okay, so these trees are growing very, very well. If you don't know it, the very top of these Doug fir, right there at that first whorl where you see the first sets of branches coming out, from that point up is a year's growth, last year's growth.
One right behind you is 3 foot tall.
So if you can imagine, and this is the hardest thing. I used to do a lot of literally door-to-door forestry. I worked for a utility, and I cut down trees in people's front yards. And I would forever talking to them about the Doug fir that was in their front yard that had not grown an inch in 20 years. And most of that growth goes on at the very top of the trees. So one of the things that I tell people when we go out and take a look at a forest is look up, look down, look all around when you're looking at a tree. So we look up in the top of the trees, and if you look up, you can see actually the top from here, you can see the top of this older forest, they're not growing as fast. These trees are growing fairly quickly. Some parts of them are growing pretty good. They're still growing pretty rapidly, almost the same as over here. Same site, same soils, same kind of exposure. And so the idea here is that they're starting to slow down a little bit because they're getting a little bit crowded, because there's a water competition going on. And then we look over here and we can see that this is going to be fairly rapidly grow in. Now, if you look in between here, it's kind of hard to imagine right now that this stand was like that stand 10 years ago. It's kind of hard to imagine that. And the truth is that, you know, from what we see right now, optimally, this site has been is a little bit more spaced right now. What we see right in front of us, over the backside, because of the mortality, it's a little bit tighter. We'll see that when we go down to the lower part. But when we look in here, you can see that we're starting to get a lot of shade down below. And this is good or bad depending on how you want your forest to grow and that competition that you have in between the trees. The spacing, and you'll see in here, we don't have a lot of light. And so when we go up into a forest, we'll actually stand in the middle of a forest, and we looked at that down below. If you look up through the canopy of the trees, and what we use this as a rating, we call it the canopy closure. And the idea is that you want the trees, needles, the branches to be pretty close to touching each other, but not actually touching. If they're right up tight next to each other, much like this stand, when we start to look up there, they're starting to lose that productivity. There's resources that are being shared, too much competition for resources. When we look over here, we can see there's a lot of spacing in between the trees. They're going to do very, very well. They're going to get very leggy. They're going to continue to grow. Now the issue with that for us in terms of productivity is that as time goes on, those lower branches are going to stay down here, and this is what we're looking at over here, is that they've been starting to prune these trees up. And the reason they're pruning those up is because the less branching, like we talked about down below, the less branching we have, the more quality of the wood that's being produced. You have a stronger wood fibers, and you have a stronger tree overall, and it's also a higher quality, which means it turns out to be higher volume down the road. So,
well, the other thing about pruning, especially the lower 8 feet, you can do that standing on the ground. It's not that tough. Good hand pruning saw does the job, and it makes your management so much easier for many years to come. You get those branches cut off when it only takes 5 minutes per tree, as high as you can reach, and now you can see how far you can see in through the plantation. You can see a long ways in there. You can see what you need to get to, what you need to do. You can work with the forest much easier than if you're just plowing through the brush, and by now there'd be mostly dead limbs. The other thing about being tight together, we talked about invasive species earlier. This pretty much shades out the invasive species. When it gets that thick, yeah, you don't want to let it go too long. Kill all the blackberries off though, and then get it thinned.
So, species selection. We have, I think it's very, in the Pacific Northwest, and specifically here in Western Washington, I feel very fortunate that we really only have about 5 species of trees for production. As compared to if you go back eastern United States, you got about 200-300 different species. It's really actually there's a whole bunch of different families, but we primarily have conifer, and we have obviously the biggest producer for us is Douglas fir, and then we select out. Now, when you selected your plantings here, where'd you get your seed stock from? Where'd you find it?
I'm not sure on those particular plantations.
In general, when we look at a site, there's classifications for sites by what we call seed zones, and what that is that it has to do with the soils as well as the sloping aspect and the general location of the species and we're selecting for trees that are adapted to be living in the general location. There's discussion now about what we call moving seed sources or seed zones for plantings, because we're looking at potential climate change is coming down the road, and so we're looking at moving where we select those species from. But as an example, you can get seed that's been collected, or seeds, trees that have been grown from seed that's been selected from, in this particular location, you can get seeds, plantings that have been, from probably within about 100-mile radius of this area, but having similar characteristics in similar soils. And those are generally available through places like the state has those nurseries, and also commercial nurseries have that. So it's not like you can go to, it's not in your best interest when you're selecting out a species for the site to go out and just buy what's available. It's best to look into what your soil types are, look at what the seed zone is, and then look at the site specifically to adapt it to that location. The other thing is, and we'll look at this a little bit later, one of the things that we're trying to move towards right now, excuse me, is some more species diversity in terms of planting. And that's kind of hard in terms of if you're looking at productivity down the road. But as you've seen as we walk through this area, we've got hemlock, we've got cedar, we've got Douglas fir, we've got alder, we've got cottonwood, spruce, a little bit of spruce, little bit of spruce. Did I miss anything?
Well, there's one noble fir here.
A noble fir.
But I haven't seen any bigger ones.
Okay.
The noble fir has been planted by somebody in the family. Somebody got visions of Christmas trees, probably.
And so.
Giant sequoia. A small grove of giant sequoia.
Oh, you got away with that, did you?
We got a few. Mostly those. Let's see. We planted a lot in memorial of my dad. On occasion, people are giving sequoias away for some reason, and somebody gets half a dozen and bring them out and find a hole to put them in. Yeah, you'll find some sequoia and you'll find some noble firs, but they've been planted, but
not commercial.
Not commercially. Something about seed zones. When you plant, a 20-acre plot, usually you're going to have it done commercially. You're going to have a planting crew that knows what they're doing and get those trees in fast. They are usually in charge of procuring the seedlings, and they know what your site is and where they're getting them from, so you're getting the right thing. Again, supervision's everything. Make sure, double check, make sure. The other thing you didn't mention though is altitude. Right here where we're standing, you're at 1,700 feet. You don't want trees that were, from cones and maybe a seed farm that was at 500 feet and put them in at 1,700. Altitude is a big part of it. I mean, you said something within 100 miles. There's a lot of lowland within 100 miles here where you might want to think twice about, or at least ask twice about, where did you collect the seeds from?
So this is what I'm saying about seed zone is it takes all those characteristics, in. In terms of elevation, it's really important also, and one of the things that we're standing here on a nice sunny day, which sometimes is difficult, aspect. When you look at where's your sun coming from? Because when we talk about tree growth, trees need 4 things: water, soil, sunlight, and space. And so those are things that we're seeing right here taking place all at the same time. And so aspect is the amount of sun that they're going to get. And it can get very, very hot up here, very, very dry on the south-facing slope. And on the north-facing slopes, not so much. And so the tree species will be adapted to that. And going back to this idea of what you select out for your site, for your plantings, that is wholly up to you. It's your land. You can plant whatever you want. If you don't want to, if you want to plant it all up in sequoia, that's fine. There's no regulation that says, in terms of regulations, there's no regulation that says you have to plant a specific species. It does say you have to plant. And you do have to get canopy cover back onto a site, especially if you're keeping your taxation profit. So when you come in to plant the site, I'm not going to ask you how much it costs, but it's not as expensive as you would think it would be, but it's not as cheap as you would think it is to get folks in here to plant these up at that 400 to 600 stems per acre.
Yeah, and you need to have some plan for protecting the trees from the animals too.
So we're going to look at that down below.
But
every single tree.
yes, yeah, and in fact, the netting is more expensive than the planting. To back up just a little bit, if you're only planting an acre, or maybe you're just trying to fill in some holes in a plantation that you've already got, and you go to some place, Silva Seed, for example, in Roy, or any seed or seedling supplier, just make sure you tell them what altitude and where your farm is, and they'll make sure you get the right seedlings. Don't try to grow seeds. Buy 2-year-old trees. Buy a bag of 1 or 200 trees to put in. Don't try to raise them from seed. You'll just go nuts. Let the pros do that part.
Well, sometimes they
The seedlings
do
work
seed.
out to be like a little less than $1 a tree. If you're gonna net, it's another $1 for a net and another $1 to have the net and some stakes to hold the nets up put on. You end up paying twice for the protection as you did for the trees.
There are some areas where they do just seed, especially big swaths of land, public land that's had wildfire and things go through that are inaccessible, and they will seed them from a helicopter.
Really?
Yeah.
Also, when you have this type of variation where you have an older stand that's mature next to an open area, that will throw seed into this area. So some of this, especially if you see any really smaller trees in here, that's probably natural seed coming in. But in general, that takes much longer to establish, and a lot of times in that time period, you'll get a lot of invasive species cover that will really slow down your replanting in there. And so we want to, by replanting a seedling that's already got its head start, you're kind of speeding that process along and making sure you don't have to do a whole lot of extra work clearing away the blackberries and the reed canary grass every single year that for many more years to get those seeds to grow.
If you just leave it, Mother Nature will take care of it. But it might take her 50 years where you can get the same results in 5 if you have it properly planted.
So are green cones still harvested for seed? It used to be
There
raw.
are seed
Yes.
farms where they will be harvesting those cones, and those are pretty cool places to go visit if you ever get a chance to tour. But they will take trees from all different areas and plant them, and then keep track of those cones and where those trees originated from and where they need to be planted into. So there's a whole network that for supplying seedlings that they do the cone collection.
They usually have what's referred to as like a seed orchard, so they have control pollinated that particular stand, so they know what you're getting essentially in those cones.
That's what we used to do with the 30-06.
Out in the forest shooting them out.
No, I was working up on the Republic over eastern Washington, and we would go out and shoot the branches off to collect the cones. But
They do still, sometimes for certain species that are a bit harder to come by, the nurseries do request to be able to go out and do stuff like that. Like we had some stands of Alaska yellow cedar, and so that was a bit harder to come by, so the nursery was interested in going out and collecting seed from that stand.
Yeah, and the conservation district, about 20 years ago, there's a subspecies of ponderosa pine native to Pierce County. It's called Fort Lewis. This is pre-JBL. So we went around and scoped out. We couldn't get permission from the fort to collect cones there. So we went all around the outskirts of the fort and ID'd trees and knocked on doors. clippers and got the cones and took them to Silvaseed, and they grew them out for us, and then we sold them in our plant sets to distribute them around the county more. So since then, Webster Nursery, the state nursery, has taken, is it called Scions? So they've taken, it's like grafting. They've grafted those ponderosas onto probably eastern Washington ponderosas, and now they have a seed nursery. So those are getting out more, and more people are planting them now because they can handle the drier weather.
And that's one of the things that we're looking at in terms of climate adaptation is where the seed source comes from, and testing to make sure that these species can be more resilient as time comes through. And this is one of the things that we talk about in a forest in terms of forest health and resilience, is that the healthier a forest is, the healthier that it's growing, the more resilient it will be to change, to any kind of change that's happening. Be that invasives that are coming in, be that changes with climate, be it fires that come through. Margaret mentioned something earlier about the idea that, we didn't mention this earlier, is that, you know, forest goes through a natural process, and through a natural process disturbance comes in and changes this successional process. And that disturbance is very important in maintaining diversity in our forest stand. So right now we're in a very diverse setting. And so we have a lot of things going on, different ages, different classes, different settings, if you would like, for a better word, for wildlife. So we have a lot of different things going on in terms of wildlife also going on this site. I don't know if any of you stepped in the elk stuff over there like I did, but the thing that's really important to understand too is that this is very important overall for the overall entire landscape. In forestry, a lot of natural resources, we use the word landscape to reflect this entire area, this idea of what we're looking at across here. And so it's really important to remember that as we go through forest management, we're part of a larger whole. The forest they're managing here in this 200 acres is connected to that forest over there and the forest on the backside. And so we're a part of a broader landscape in terms of that change that's occurring. But we also have to, because we humans are making decisions about what's going to happen on this site, to kind of use the best science. And so that's one of the reasons we talk about getting in here and planting very densely. And as Steve pointed out, sorry, not Keith, not Dave. Steve pointed out, if you wanted to, you could let this forest regrow naturally, but it would take a long, long time. And more than likely, that alder over there would take over the site first. More than likely.
More than likely.
More than likely. So we do have a stop down below.
Regeneration plan.
What's it? Yes, intergeneration.
And you need to submit a regeneration plan.
Yes. Okay. These things. Okay. Real quick. Yeah, Holly.
Yeah. I just want to do a little commercial. So we've been talking a lot about all this stewardship and DNR. We are hiring 14 foresters for Western Washington. That's specifically about technical advice for you about planting, about creating wildlife habitat, all the things. So Rosalind and I work in the small forest landowner shop that has a lot of technical assistance and financial programs if you're involved in harvest and plantations and such, what we're seeing. But we also have a whole nother program that's really growing about helping you give advice about what to plant, what trees work, what soils, what habitat, or all of your, again, it's your objectives. But just wanted to give a little commercial. There's a lot of resources out there, especially as we're addressing climate change and forest health as a state. Our state has put in money, and so give us a call, and also working with your conservation districts. There's my commercial. Thank you.
I'd like another commercial, and that is the Pierce Conservation District native plant sale for those of us who have smaller acreages. Wonderful place to get products to plant on your acreage.
Yeah, and pretty much all the districts in the state have a native plant sale in the spring. So we're selling those couple-year-old seedlings. They're bare roots, so they don't have any soil with them, so they're easy to plant. If you just, like me, have only 3 acres of woods, I'm not going to go to Weyerhaeuser and get, sacks of hundreds of Doug fir. So it's a great resource for smaller properties.
in general, and Margaret and I are funded through some grants to do exactly this, small forest land assistance for our conservation districts are involved in. But one of the things that's really important is to understand it can be a very complex situation, especially when it comes back to the regulatory component of what we do, what you do on your land. And then we do have a stop down below. We're going to be talking about paired planting. I think we'll look at that down below. But one of the things before we get there, because this is a much nicer place to talk about these things, because it's kind of wet and soggy down there, if I remember correctly. So one of the things you'll notice, there's quite a bit of grass on the ground here. So there was some management that occurred here. That's not native, not just grass grown in here. It's been controlled, and the revegetation has grown. Understory species that have come up in this area are being managed, and that's really important to understand. Is that I don't know if anybody noticed, there's very little Scotch broom here on the site. Does everybody know what Scotch broom is? Yeah.
You see it blooming here by the side of the road all over the place. Anything that's bright yellow, Scotch broom.
Okay, another thing that we don't see is the Himalayan Blackberry. Yeah, okay.
We're right over
Oh.
on the point.
And
You don't see as many as there used to be.
Yeah, that's right.
I'm not trying to be picky.
Well, yeah, you can't. Oh, if you don't fight that every year, it comes back.
Okay, so
You don't see any back here.
no.
It's been shaded out.
And so this is the thing that we want to talk about. It's very, very important when we're talking after the planting gets done and the plants are we want to getting established. We want to reduce competition from other species. And those species could be invasive species, or they can be 100% native, like that alder that's popping up right over there. They can take over a stand and make it very unproductive for timber or for tree species, or it'll delay the growth of the species coming in. And in some cases, if you let the stand go, and this is one of the things that we're running into a lot, one of the things that we look at these 10, 15, 20 acre parcels that have been logged 10 years ago but were never replanted. It's now all Scotch broom and Himalayan blackberry. And so you can't just go back in there and plant Douglas fir and hope it's going to grow, because Douglas fir is much like us, likes to stand out in the sun. So it's going to have competition, direct competition. So you're going to have to go in and control it. Now, you can do that control all sorts of different ways. You can do it mechanically. You can go in with a machine. You can do it by hand, cutting it out, pulling it out. You can go in, taking a natural process and just hoping it gets shaded out by putting, like we're talking in here, we have natural control through the shading of other plants. Or you can go in with herbicide application. And yes, there are quite a few questions about that, but there are applications where that is very important for us to look at, and how this application can be done.
This plantation has had both of those.
All of them.
We've been through here, and we've cut out the competing species, and we have sprayed the blackberries and Scotch broom, especially to a lesser extent some of the vine maple. And you say this is natural. True, it is now, but it was done mechanically and chemically before it got to this stage also.
So those methodologies that we talked about, the mechanical, the chemical, or a product, that, I told you I worked for utilities. They told us that never use the word chemicals, use the word product when we talk about herbicides. So the idea is that that is what's been done over here. So this has been this is a managed stand, and that's very important to understand that that's another cost on top of the management. But that cost needs to be engaged as we go through the long-term idea that this is a legacy forest. It's going to be here for 100 years, 150 years, hopefully longer. But
that's just this plantation.
Yeah.
The farm should be here for 1,000.
Exactly. So investing is very, very important. And this is one of the things, one of the hurdles, probably one of the larger hurdles that we have in small lands management, is there's a cost up front. And And that cost may or may not be seen for some time. So that's a really important thing to understand. And that's one of the things too, and we'll do another advertisement for a party that's not here right now. If you all are familiar with the Department of Agriculture has a program in it called the NRCS.
Natural Resources Conservation Service.
Okay, so what they do is, if you're familiar, I use this, most people know about the farm subsidies, that people out in the farmlands get subsidies to help grow their trees, or grow their plants agriculturally. NRCS will actually come in, and there are cost share programs, financial cost share programs, that will help with getting non-commercial activities done on small lands. If you're making less than $1 million a year, they'll help you out with the management of your lands. If you go through a process, and the beginning of that process is
You write a forest plan.
you write a forest management plan, and those forest management plans are going to have in it a discussion about what you're going to do on an area like this, where we have to go in and do some herbicide application or some hand pruning, mechanical pruning, or hand clearing, and the work that we're doing over here, where we're going to come in here and do some pruning. There's no commercial venture. Well, there are actually commercial ventures about cutting branches off of some species and selling those, but for the most part, this is not a commercial venture. This is a cost. And so those programs are very important for a lot of landowners because it'll break that little hump that they have to get over for the management of that land. And so that's one of the things that we're doing in terms of the outreach that we have is primarily focused on getting to the small landowners and giving them the assistance and the help and the leg up in this management. And that program is very similar to another program, which Rosalind didn't talk about.
Yeah, it's not sort of fully up and running yet on the west side. The cost sharing program is
I was going to talk about the FREP program.
Oh, the FREP. Okay, so for the riparian management.
But I was going to say for the NRCS program, we have a very similar program with the state now that's on the east side, but now it's coming to the west side. So look us up for that as well, for your pre-commercial thinning, just for forest health, fuels reduction, that kind of thing. Because even though fire's been a focus on the east side, it's starting to be a concern on the west side as well.
The conservation stewardship program's a very good one too.
And so the difference, so there's, and inside the NRCS, there's even more acronyms. There's a program called the EQIP program, and that's the one that deals with forest improvement or forest enhancement improvements. The CSP program is more suited to folks like the Townsends and the Coburg Farm, where they have an existing forest that they're doing really good on. They want to do some enhancements, and those enhancements would be things like bird boxes. They'd be like, tell me.
Planting, thinning.
Raptor poles.
Raptor
Making,
poles.
Wildlife piles.
habitat.
Habitat. Yeah, they're big on habitat.
Snags.
So
They got a list of like 50 or 60 different. What's the word for them?
practices.
Enhancements. Thank you.
Enhancements and practices. So it may seem, it might not seem, it would seem counterintuitive, but one of a really important measurement of a forest is large standing dead wood, dead trees standing in your forest. It's actually a sign of health, of overall ecological health of your forest. And one of the things that these enhancements will do, and the programs will do, is will actually pay for you to go out and kill trees in your stand, and large trees, to create roosting nesting habitat. So dead trees, tall dead trees, have a significant diversity in habitats all up and down it. It's different biomes all throughout it. So when we talk about management, it's kind of interesting because it sounds a little bit, once again I'll use that word counterintuitive, that the government would pay you to go out and kill your trees. It's not every single one of them. It's
Selected
about 5
trees.
It's about 5 trees per acre in most cases. But the idea is that there is help out there, and that's one of the reasons that you would contact us mean collectively us, in regards to those type of programs if you have that concern. Going back to this management of this stand, I think what we'll do is we'll go down that way.
Yes.
We'll go down this way. We're going to see a lot really interesting things down below here. And one of the things that's very cool about this is that the work that they've been going on has been for the last 50 years here.
Okay.
It's the same, 50 years plus.
Close enough.
Yeah, 50 years plus. It's the same work that we're doing today. And the things that they did back in the day are the same things that we do today. And so I think it's really cool lesson to learn about what works and what doesn't, but also how to address it. Go back to, as an example, we'll go down through here with the netting and the cost factors for netting. One of the problems that we run into is how long will that netting stay around? It's supposed to be biodegradable. It is, to an extent.
I think it's photodegradable, not biodegradable.
Degradable, supposedly degradable.
It's supposed to go away.
It's supposed to go away.
It depends. It depends on the make and the model and the formula in any given year. We got nets that have been here for 20 years or more, and others that didn't last 3 or 4.
So as we walk down through here, one of the things you'll notice over here is there's still burn sign in the old forest, which is kind of cool. And if you head down, there's a little trail over here.
Some more maple, some fine maples growing up in here. We got a hemlock. Lots of green canary grass down here because it's definitely in a more wet zone where it likes to thrive. You got some of the native blackberry. So all of these are kind of in here competing for resources with your trees. So you really want to be looking at controlling those when those trees are really small, so they can get enough to get a root system established and grow above that to get both moisture and the light. So this area is a really unique demonstration of a creative solution to some of your problems that you can have with especially deer browse and elk browse when you're trying to establish trees. So this, if you'll notice here, there are 2 trees here. This one is a Sitka spruce, and this is a western red cedar. And so they've been planted together here, sort of to protect the cedar, because they're wanting to have the cedar in here because it's a better suited tree to this wetter slope, and it's a more valuable timber tree in the long term. So the problem with cedar is they're really delicious. The elk and the deer love them. They will often even pull off your tubes like we saw up there. They'll pull them off, they'll rip them open. And so they're not always very effective. So what western red cedar are good at, though, is they're very shade tolerant. So they have the ability to survive under another canopy cover. So what happens here is they've planted the spruce tree and then a cedar tree right next to it, and then cut the spruce tree off so that the cedar has the advantage here over in the top. But also, as you can see, these spruce trees are very prickly, long. They're not as tasty, so they're still in pretty good shape. So they literally act as a buffer for this middle tree, so you're not getting eaten and it's not getting rubbed on by the antlers, damaging the trunk. Oh yeah.
That wasn't protected, so this tiny little scraggly.
They were all planted together.
Right.
It was protected. The spruce died.
Didn't make it. Right.
And that cedar's lucky. It made it. You can look around and find a number of cedar that have just been eaten to the ground, and even though they're 7, 8 years old now, they're maybe they were 12 inches tall when they're planted. Today they're still only 3 or 4.
Yeah. So it's a significant pressure here that we're getting on the cedar. So this is a really great solution. If you have the time and resources to manage for this, and
It's really quite cost effective too.
Yeah.
To put a net in. Okay, the spruce tree, it costs less than a net. and if you put in nets, you have to go back and straighten up the nets that have been knocked over by the wind, the rain, the animals, the snow. You got to do that every year for 3, 4, 5 years, and it's a huge task, and you need to have the time and the people to be able to do that, especially that first year or two after it was planted. And as the fur get up above the deer, one at a time, they're safe. They're big enough to withstand, to fly on their own, so to speak. But yeah, it's the first couple of years, and even the next couple of years after that, you got to keep going back and straightening nets every year. It becomes a huge task. One of the reasons we don't want to plant, or more than once every 7 years, because it takes 4, 5, 6 years to get that plantation up above the deer, especially. Yeah, he's looking at the top.
The
Spruce weevil there.
the weevil. Yes.
There's actually two.
It's quite common. It's very difficult to get the spruce to do well. If you look around, the few spruce that, this spruce has been cut out. The top is right there. I don't know what the top looks like, but my guess is it's going to look a lot like that. Most of the spruce, it's actually a pine weevil.
It's a white pine weevil.
It does really, really well in the spruce.
Yep.
It's difficult to grow spruce here. That's just what usually happens. The top gets attacked. Yeah. Not just the top per se, but any of the tips of the branches. But the top is up there seems to catch it more often than not.
And that's a good, to jump off that, one of the things we want to do when we're protecting our young seedlings is that we really want to be protecting the top of the tree. The top of the tree is a lot of the growth potential, and if you lose that top, you're pretty much stagnated for a couple of years. Some of those other branches will eventually take over. Like you can see, there's a couple that are doubling up there to try and continue growing, but really slows the trees down. And for especially Douglas fir, once that top has really died off, and especially if you're looking at mature trees, if you see the top dying off, that's usually a symptom that it's on the downhill decline. You're never really going to recover from that top, and you've lost a lot of your potential to continue growing for many more years.
But it's also important to say that different bugs eat at different things, and this eats in our region mostly spruce, northeast white pine and spruce, but it doesn't. I've never seen white pine weevil on Doug fir. You may have occasionally, but I
I've
haven't
never
yet.
seen it.
So it's irrelevant to the Doug fir. The spruce, am I right? You're primarily growing them to cut them out as the cedars get better?
Well, there's a few. This one back here, it's actually got a nice top.
Yes.
And it's still there.
Yep.
If the cedar didn't survive,
Then you know,
and there's no reason to take out the spruce, we leave it. The odds of it growing tall into maturity are slim, but there's no reason to take it out. Okay, it's the only thing that's growing there. We'll grow a spruce tree there.
There are spruce that are being grown that are weevil resistant and not necessarily not going to get it. So
I've never seen one. I've seen some lucky ones. And as soon as you point a lucky one out, you go around, look at it, and say, well, I just see, this tip and this tip, and the tops come back in the spruce, and they're pretty good about thinning themselves out, for that matter. So even if you do have the top die, if you just leave it a few years, usually you'll get a single top. If you really want a spruce tree there, you might have to come back sometimes and take out an extra top, but it's hard to get a spruce tree to grow to maturity. And yet, you look around, the natural ones that we've got here, they're great. They're growing big and tall and strong. You just look through the forest, on occasion you'll see a natural spruce that's it's done quite well.
And that's a great point to jump off of. Is when we have when we're talking about pests and diseases, every pest and disease has specific host species that are more susceptible to getting that or are carriers for that. And that's one great argument for having a diversity of species on your landscape is, we want that matrix so that if a pest and disease is present there, that you're not getting everything devastated by that one thing. We want to have, some kind of a barrier for that. And so, this is a great solution to use for our one problem, but then also knowing that, we're not having spruce throughout this whole area that will be affected this way is great. And knowing, what diseases are present on your landscape and what aren't might help you determine which species you're going to be choosing for planting in your area.
Right, like laminated root rot.
Yeah.
And pick another species.
Right, that's a great one. And that one,
That's one of the big killers of the fir.
Yeah, definitely. So Douglas fir is really affected by laminated root rot, but cedar is not. So knowing that future
It's not
potential.
immune.
What?
It's not immune.
No, but it's much better.
Yeah, it's much less susceptible.
Yeah. So we're looking in our future potential for having trees on this site, planting something like a cedar is much better.
We've planted cedar in pockets where we've found what we suspect to be root rot in harvesting. If you really want to avoid it completely, you should be thinking in terms of probably pine or alder. Something that simply does not get the laminated root rot. This little, what we call the cedar hook or the 76 annex, the trees, this is the 76 plantation again, right behind you, where we started, except we were all over on the other side. Down here it's a little closer to what we had in mind. The area where we're standing had some big trees on it, and when Mom and Dad did this, they did the 76 plantation, they were focusing mostly on some acreage that was basically unproductive. And then these trees along here were left. We took this 2 or 3 acres out when we cut the plantation, what's now the 2014 plantation. This part we planted in cedar, partly because the soil is damp, partly because it's going to be shaded by the trees here in the 76 plantation. We thought it would have a chance, and partly because we wanted to see how well the cedar would do. It's just an experiment. The idea is that when these trees are harvested in another 50 years, say, this part here, well, by then the spruce will be cut out and it'll just be the cedar growing, but it'll be left, and then this will be replanted like, I don't know, 2080 or something, or 20, yeah. Fast forward another 100 years, when these trees are gone and the trees that replace them are ready to be harvested. By then, the cedar you see here should be some nice, big, commercially viable trees. They will probably be harvested along with the unit that replaces that plantation. And then it'll all be, I don't know, we'll see what's suitable. Most of it will probably be in Doug fir. Maybe there'll be some other species as well. But it'll be, in another 200 years, you shouldn't be able to see a whole lot of difference between this little piece here and that part of the plantation up there.
This would be a good area to also talk about prep. So we have our stream corridor that we walked across when we came in. That's continued here, and so this is that riparian buffer that was left when this was harvested.
Now
so
the creek we crossed when we went across the bridge, it's just down there. You can see it off the, if you look in the right place. It's Cronus Creek.
PREP program, the Forest Riparian Easement program through DENA. Do you have any
Yes, I did. In fact, we applied for this particular section right here. I'm not quite sure where the paperwork is on that.
Yeah, we're about 5 years out, some of the applications. But again, hired more people in the FRET program, a bunch of foresters, and more money for cruises to get the value of the trees. And so they are thinking we should be able to cut that in half pretty soon. So wherever you are on that application list, I hope you get that. But that's,
Well, the trouble is,
yeah, go ahead.
we got our name on the list, or
Yeah.
so we thought. We turned in all the paperwork, but our name didn't show up on the list.
Okay.
And so here we are now, 6 years later, and somebody went back and actually did find the paperwork. So now they're trying to kind of put it on top of the pile because we did apply back in
Yeah.
2014.
Well, Steve, we'll talk.
So anyway, we're working on it, and I don't know where we're at.
That's if you have more than 20 acres and you're required to leave trees for the riparian zone, the state will compensate you at least 50% of the volume of your